response. And Arvind very beautifully brought in several things as to what was there in Jawaharlal Nehru's objective resolution and what was not there. For example, fraternity, dignity, and several other things which are very important, which were left out, which came up in the latter course of the Constituent Assembly and the discussions about the Constitution. Today, we will look at very specifically Ambedkar's presentation of the first draft Constitution in 1948 and the final speech of Ambedkar on 25th November 1949, when he presented the final version of the Constitution, which eventually got signed on the 26th, and we became a republic as of 26th January 1950. Now, many of you have been independently asking me, saying, why is it so important to read these things? In what manner are they relevant to 2024? We will be exploring many of these questions in the course of the lecture today. So over to you, Arvind.
Thanks, Suresh, and great to see all of you all back here again today. And we were wondering how to take things forward from the last 2 days discussion. And the thought which we had is the question of context is sometimes very, very important, in the sense that everybody, right? I mean, everybody has a difficulty, of course. You look at this book, this fat book, and how do you open it and what do you read in it? What makes meaning in this text is a very challenging question. And I don't think a civics book necessarily is to make it easier or better, because there's a certain absence of, say, passion or heart. My feeling in a civics textbooks. The content is there. There's no problem with the content. Executive, legislature, judicial, readers, etc., etc. But the context is missing. The context in terms of why the provisions are there, and what are the history from which they emerge, and what is it that what are the concerns that they people. And so the way in which understanding the Constitution is really about understanding the context from which the Constitution makers, in a sense, emerge as well. And that's a very, very important way of going about it. And and of course, I mean, I go back again. This is again just a recommendation. If you go back to again Glanville Austin, actually we should have his text as a recommended reading as well, but we don't. But keep this in mind anyway. Yeah, you're saying my voice is breaking.
Yeah, it is breaking. Arvind,
yeah, Arvind, yeah.
I don't know what the problem is. Let me try and see if I can connect to my phone. Maybe that will work better. I don't know. Sorry about this. Okay, good.
Much better.
Okay. So I better get my internet at home sorted out. So anyway, yeah. Okay. So the actually, if you think of the drafting of the Constitution, right, it's very interesting that lawyers have produced mostly, right, dull, dry, and boring accounts of the Constitution, which are unreadable generally. I mean, why? I mean, if I was in the ordinary law firm office now, I had all the law books behind. You go to Suresh's office, you'll see the law books behind, right? And if you think of the Constitution, the way lawyers have written about the Constitution is like Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, all the case law under it you'll get, right? And it's not necessarily inspiring for people to get into. But of course, once you get into it, you need to know that, right? And that's very, very important. But I think as the entry point, a constitutional textbook is not an easy entry point into the spirit or the soul of the Constitution, right? And the person who's done it best, actually, interestingly, is a historian. And the guy I'm referring to is someone called Glanville Austin. It's called Cornerstone of a Nation, the Indian Constitution, one book. And the second book is called Working a Democratic Republic. I'm forgetting, Working a Democratic Country. That's what I think it's called. The second book, you'll find it. And that's also by Glanville Austin. The first book is about the drafting of the Constitution. And the second book is about how the Constitution has worked, right? In the period since its inception, right? And it gives you, in a sense, the stories of the histories underlying the first book underlying the provisions, and the second book underlying for example, the emergency judgment, underlying a range of stories that are underlying it. So, Working a Democratic Constitution, that's the second book. So again, these are two reference points, which might be useful or interesting for you all to consider. Why I mentioned it actually is because Glanville Lawson talks about, again, when he talks about the drafting of the Constitution, he talks about four key figures, right? Four key figures. That is Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, Ambedkar, and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. These are the four, what he calls the four musketeers, or the four main figures, or the four dominant figures in the drafting of the Indian Constitution. Of course, I mean, our story, right? Story we've been telling you is these four figures are important, right? But you also have to look at Jaipal Singh to understand the Adivasi viewpoint. And the second big point, which I should have mentioned, we didn't get time last class, is the founding mothers, right, of the Indian Constitution. What is the impact that they've had on the drafting of the Indian Constitution? I think Vinay is here as well. I think at some point, Vinay, on the chat, please share, right, a link to both the image of the founding mothers which you have, as well as to Achut Chetan's book, right? So that's the other big impact which one has to talk about. I don't know if we necessarily want to do that now, but keep it in mind, right? And Glenn Lawson has these four figures in mind, but beyond the four figures, there are other figures who are very important. One is the founding mothers, and Hansa Mehta Suresh mentioned earlier, of course, but the founding mothers, Amrit Kaur, Hansa Mehta, Dakshayani Veluyathan, who is the first Dalit woman as well, a range of figures who are also important in the drafting of the Indian Constitution. These stories are important because these stories are what really give lifeblood and passion and a sense of understanding to what the document is. And once you know what the document is, once you get interested in the document, then the world is there to explore. But the first step is what I hope we can get to do by reading a little bit of the debates which underlie the drafting of the Constitution itself, right? And here, of course, I mean, we talked about the founding mothers and we talked about Jaipal Singh. But I want to go back to, of course, the other central and the key figure, really. We talked about Nehru, of course. The other central figure, of course, is Ambedkar and his contribution to the making of the Indian Constitution. Right? And the range of ways one can understand that. Again, one can look at it both through the opening speech, the closing speech, as well as really a range of absolutely incredible interventions on um, on a range of provisions which during the during the during the debates on which he makes his contribution. Right? So there's a way in which he's thinking, a constitutional philosophy. If you read all of his interventions in the Constitutional Assembly, you get a sense of his thinking, his political philosophy, coming from a certain kind of a background of marginalization and oppression, right? So that's why the Constitution, in that sense, of course, I mean, today the figure we see, again, this is a point we can debate, right? The figure you see of Ambedkar in all parts of the countries with holding the Constitution in his hand, and it's of course he's got an iconic, significant status beyond, right? Beyond the beyond what might have originally been envisaged. There's another debate altogether. But just point you again in one direction. The person is very critical, right, of this. Is one, of course, is Anand Teltumbde's in his new book on Dr. Ambedkar called The Iconoclast, right? Where he's critical of this entire notion of, of thinking of Ambedkar in the context of the Constitution. And second, of course, is Arundhati Roy's introduction to Annihilation of Caste, which again we can talk about much later, where she makes the point. Again, it's a point worth considering, right? Ambedkar has in his hand a copy of the Constitution, not Annihilation of Caste, right? So what is the significance of Ambedkar's connection, linkage to one particular document, which is the Constitution, and not Annihilation of Caste at one level, not, for example, the conversion to Buddhism, not a range of other points which might be considered important in other perspectives in thinking about Ambedkar. But our interest in this section is to consider Ambedkar in the context of the drafting of the Constitution. Right? What was his contribution, as it were, to the making of this particular document? Right. So what I
Arvind,
will.
Arvind, if I can come in just briefly. No, it will be very interesting to see that Ambedkar himself was surprised when he was made into the chairperson of the drafting committee. And this whole debate about annihilation of the caste, one of the most important books that he had written, for which Arundhati Roy had given a foreword, The Saint and the something.
Doctor and the Saint.
The Doctor and the Saint. I know many people here may not know that one of this most brilliant books is The Annihilation of Caste. And what he came into, in fact, he says that in the earlier thing also, where he said, I didn't come here to become the chairperson of the committee. I was surprised. You see, and so one of the primary things that he actually brought in, which Arvind had pointed out last time, was the issue of fraternity and dignity, which is at the bottom of all the political demands that people would have. So perhaps Arvind, sometime later, you could also talk about what are the specific introductions, specific contributions that Ambedkar brought about because of his own life experience and being able to go beyond his life.
Yeah. No, I just try to pull up the reference point from the closing speech, right, to what Suresh just shared. Somebody just read that. Can you? Sorry, I don't think I've shared the
Can't read
screen,
it.
so you can't see. Let me just share it. Can anybody?
Yeah, Sainthan, can you make Arvind me?
No, I can do it. No, yeah, fine, fine. This is the closing speech, right?
Yeah.
Just read. Somebody just read this last paragraph.
And let's take one paragraph, one person, so we have many voices.
I'll go.
Yeah,
Please,
please go ahead.
I'm glad to find that with the exception of a solitary member, there is a general consensus of appreciation from the members of the Constituent Assembly of the work done by the drafting committee. I'm sure the drafting committee feels happy to find the spontaneous recognition of its labors expressed in such generous terms. As to the compliments that have been showered upon me both by the members of the assembly as well as by colleagues of the drafting committee, I feel so overwhelmed that I can't find adequate words to express fully my gratitude to them. I came into the Constituent Assembly with no greater aspiration than to safeguard the interest of the scheduled caste. I had not the remotest idea that I would be called upon to undertake more responsible functions. I was therefore greatly surprised when the Assembly elected me to the drafting committee. I was more than surprised when the drafting committee elected me to be its chairman. There were in the drafting committee men bigger, better, and more competent than myself, such as my friend Sir Alladi Krishna Swami Iyer. I am grateful to the Constitution Assembly and the drafting committee for reposing in me so much trust and confidence and to have chosen me as their instrument and given me this opportunity of serving the country.
Yeah, no, just to again see the point being that to be more familiar with the text, right? So you can pick up on references, right? I'm just trying to show you Suresh said a point. I'm saying where's the point? Just try and figure that about, right? And so the part of the idea, of course, is you get a greater familiarity with the opening speech and the closing speech, right? And what I also want to you've seen the range of questions I've shared with you. Let me just find it again, if I can just. Okay, anyway, I think I can't find it now. Hopefully you have it with you, the questions you have, right? You all have it with you?
I'm just sharing it, Arvind. Hang on.
Share it again with that. And maybe no, let me try and open it. I should be able to open it. It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
1 second. Let me just-
Sainthan, make it one page at a time. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I've got it now.
Should I stop sharing then?
Yeah, I've got it. No problem.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sharing mine. Yeah. So see, there are a range of questions here, which I've tried putting together to try and think of, of the of the of this particular of both the opening speech as well as the closing speech, right? And obviously, 2 hours is not enough time to look at all the questions, but let's take a couple of questions which I think are important, both from the point of view of the question itself and from the point of view of how do you answer the question, right? And take this one, right? The, the question of reference to constitutional morality and what do you think he means by this particular concept, right? Keep that as the question in mind, and that's the question I want to look at for the opening speech. And let's try and look at the text itself. Uh, this will be the opening speech. Yeah. Can you see the opening speech in front of you?
No, we're only seeing your questions.
Okay, I'm going to just share it again. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Wonderful. Okay. Right. Okay. Somebody just read that. This is the section on the on constitutional morality as from reading from the as to the accusation.
Can any of the Kudu members read it? Starting from as to the accusation.
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. As to the accusation that the draft constitution has produced a good part of the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935, I make no apologies. There is nothing to be ashamed of in borrowing. It involves no plagiarism. Nobody holds any patent rights in the fundamental ideas of a constitution. What I'm sorry about is that the provisions taken from the Government of India Act 1935 relate mostly to the details of administration. I agree that administrative details should have no place in constitution. I wish very much that the drafting committee would see its way to avoid their inclusion in the constitution. But this is to be said on the necessity which justifies their inclusion. Grote, the historian of Greece, has said that the diffusion of constitutional morality, not merely among the majority of any community, but throughout the whole, is the indispensable condition of government at once free and peaceable. Since even any powerful and obstinate minority may render the working of a free institution impracticable without being strong enough to conquer ascendancy for themselves.
Go on.
Should I continue? Okay.
Yes, please.
By constitutional morality, Grote meant a paramount reverence for the forms of constitution, enforcing obedience to authority, acting under and within these forms, yet combined with habit of open speech, of action subject only to define legal control, and unrestrained censure of those very authorities as to all their public acts, combined too with a perfect confidence in the bosom of every citizen amidst the bitterness of party contest, that the forms of constitution will not be less sacred in the eyes of his opponents than in his own.
Yeah. One more paragraph, please.
While everybody recognizes the necessity of the diffusion of constitutional morality for the peaceful working of a democratic constitution, there are two things interconnected with it which are not, unfortunately, generally recognized. One is that the form of administration has a close connection with the form of the constitution. The form of administration must be appropriate to and in the same sense as the form of the constitution. The other is that it is perfectly possible to pervert the constitution without changing its form by merely changing the form of administration and to make it inconsistent and opposed to the spirit of the constitution. It follows that it is only where people are saturated with constitutional morality, such as the one described by Grote, the historian, that one can take the risk of omitting from constitutional details of administration and leaving it for the legislature to prescribe them. The question is, can we presume such a diffusion of constitutional morality? Constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. I think this is constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment.
Constitutional morality.
It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic.
Great. Okay. So the question I have for you, right, is why is Ambedkar referencing the notion of constitutional morality? What is the question to which he's what is the question to which constitutional morality is the answer? Is there in the first two lines? Somebody just you have the text in front of you as well. Somebody can tell me why is he referencing constitutional morality?
I mean, it's in a way absolute morality, right? Not just because a majority agrees to something that has to be the right.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I mean, you've got into the interpretation of what is constitutional morality. That's a fantastic point. We'll get to that point in a second. But just the question as to why. What does the first paragraph say? Wonderful.
Shaivya is written to justify including administration details in the constitution.
So, in a sense, right, the answers to the question of why is the Indian constitution so long, right? His response is, what choice do we have? Our people don't have constitutional morality. We need to cultivate constitutional morality. In the meantime, we have to mention or we put in all the details of administration because it's not understood necessarily what is the thing to be done in a procedural sense. So, because of the procedural problem, we included a range of details. That's why the constitution is so long, right? But if you read it, right, it's a paramount reverence for the forms of the constitution, and there's a in the bosom of every man there is the idea that that we have a reverence for this form called the constitution. And he says that reverence, which might have been there in England with a long parliamentary history tradition, is not there in India. Therefore, we want to specify all the details. That's the answer, which in effect Ambedkar is giving us on the question of why, right? But again, the question I felt, again, I don't know what you all feel about it. I felt that the terminology constitutional morality is not necessarily self-explanatory. You don't, even if you read the Grote quotation in some detail, you get a sense of Grote somewhere making the point that you want the uh, absolute expression, right, of the freedom of your own thoughts is one dimension of constitutional morality in a peaceable manner, in a sense that it doesn't disturb the question of the way the state is structured, etc. And the fact that it's accepted, the criticism is accepted, that's one feature you get a constitutional morality. But beyond that, you don't get necessarily a good sense. What do you mean by constitutional morality? And we've discussed, again, not we have discussed, but I'm saying the courts have discussed this in great detail at much later points in time, right? So one question is how then, right, do you understand this term called constitutional morality, which to my understanding, again, you may differ, and that's totally fine, which to my understanding is not very clear in the speech itself. You don't necessarily get a sense. I mean, if you say your response to the details of administration, I think Ravi, who spoke a little earlier, that point, right, about saying it's different from popular morality, is different from the morality of the majority, is not necessarily there in that in Grote's analysis. It's not necessarily there. You can interpret it, you can read into it, but it's said in that clear kind of terms, right? So what then is the way forward in interpreting this term called constitutional morality? So I'm just going to put forward two ways of potentially going about it, right? One is again what you do, right? You'll say, hey, this is what Ambedkar says in the Constitutional Assembly. Is this term integral or important to Ambedkar's understanding? Does he mention it elsewhere? Does it come in other parts of the text, as it were, right? And so you look at other. One is the interpretation within the terms of the text, what we read. That's one way of interpreting it. The other is interpreting it in terms of other references to a term called constitutional morality, right? And here I just want to reference again very interestingly, right? It's a very term which is very important to him, and he invokes it later as well in his career, right? I want to just reference one. One is I think the First Amendment when he references the term constitutional morality. Second is in the speech he makes, right, on what he calls conditions precedent for the successful working for democracy, where he references the term constitutional morality. I'll just show you that text now. And is it cool? Okay, fine, great, yeah. This is something which I had put together, but I'm happy for somebody to just read this out, right? That okay, somebody please read this out. Can you see the text? 3 references to in to the notion of constitutional morality.
Yeah.
Okay, please read that.
From where?
Yeah, from there are at least 3 references.
I see a different document. I see the opening speech still.
Okay, then I think I'll just share it again. I think that's the problem. Sorry, guys. Okay, great. You can see it now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Okay, let me go.
the 3 references. Read that one.
Yeah, there are at least 3 references in Dr. Ambedkar's corpus to the notion of constitutional morality. In a speech in a parliament on the Constitution, Bill 1954, he notes, but as soon as Swaraj presented itself, everybody thought that there was the prospect of political authority passing into the hands of a majority, which did not possess what might constitutionally be called constitutional morality. Their official doctrine was inequality of classes. Though there is inequality in every community or whatever be the word, that inequality is a matter of practice. It is not an official dogma. But with the majority in this country, inequality as embodied in their Chatur Varna is an official doctrine. Secondly, their caste system is a sword of political and administrative discrimination.
So we'll just read this part. See, what he's saying is that when Swaraj presents itself, political authority passes in the hands of the majority, which does not possess what might be called constitutional morality. So obviously here the reference point is to the entire question of the caste system, and the idea that the idea of graded and hierarchical inequality, which is Ambedkar's thinking, which is the idea that you don't think of everybody as equal, right? In our country, we don't think of everybody as equal. We think of everybody in terms of the caste that they come from, right? And if you think in terms of the caste that you come from, then the majority will never be the majority, which is a political majority. It will always be a communal majority. The way in this frame of thinking, right? So that's one hint you get of what constitutional morality could mean, right? In the Indian context, in the speaking constitutional assembly, you don't get the connecting link to the Indian context, but here you get it. You said that clearly, as far as he's concerned, constitutional morality is a reference to the doctrine of Chaturvarna, is a reference to the problem of the caste system, which grades people unequally on grounds of caste. Okay, let's look at the second speech, second reference. Yeah, please read the second one.
In another speech titled Conditions Precedent for the Successful Working of Democracy, he identified the observance of constitutional morality as one of the conditions precedent. In his judgment, the Constitution only contains legal provisions, only a skeleton. The flesh of the skeleton is to be found in what we call constitutional morality. The framework of constitutional morality would mean that there must be no tyranny of the majority over the minority. The minority must always feel safe that although the majority is carrying on the government, the minority is not being hurt or the minority is not being hit below the belt.
Great. So I think that's quite explicit and clear, right? You don't need any further explanation of what he means by constitutional morality. It's clearly a reference to a problem of a majoritarian society, where the majority does not think of the interests of the minority, in which case you have to think of cultivating constitutional morality. Again, going back to the language of the Constitutional Assembly, which is really the most famous reference, you remember the last part where it says, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. Are people yet to learn it? It has to be cultivated. Right? So you get a sense of what do you mean by cultivating constitutional morality in the context of a society which is based on caste. And that's the fundamental reference point, right? And you get a sense of its rooting in the Indian context, not only from the speech in the Constituent Assembly. You can interpret that, but you interpret it in the context of maybe other references to constitutional morality in other Ambedkar's works. And that's the one way of thinking about this terminology itself and what it means, right? And again, I think the metaphor, right, in the Constituent Assembly of the word cultivate is a very important one, right? You have to cultivate constitutional morality, right? That is not, it's not something which you can, which will arise like that. You have to grow it, right? Cultivation is a metaphor of growing something. It means tilling the soil, it means adding the manure, it means a range of watering, it means the way in which you have to take that effort to grow something. Again, what is the metaphor of the effort of grow, right? And there, I think the interesting or the important linkage is the question of how change happens as far as society is concerned, right? Again, the Ambedkar's core, I mean, again, the most important point, right, is he's a thinker of the problem of the social, right? We think of this in civil liberties tradition again, right? We think of the state as the problem. That's the way we think of it, and rightly so. The state is the problem, right? When it comes to the question of encounter deaths, comes to the question of police violence, torture, state is the problem. Ambedkar's strong reference point, of course, is the idea that state is a problem, but what about society? How can he ignore society as a problem? Society has a certain way in which, again, the word, he doesn't use the word, but the totalitarian dimension, right? Where it's totalized and controls all dimensions of the way you act, who you choose to love, who you choose to live with, how you choose to worship, who you can interact with. If all those elements are controlled in that deep kind of a way, then society is a problem. How are we going to deal with the problem of society? And you can only deal with the problem of society by cultivating this notion called constitutional morality. Cultivating constitutional morality means you have to transform, right, the way people think about the relationships with each other. Again, we go back to the idea of the Constitution. The Constitution is a relationship between the state and the individual. It's also about the relationship between individuals per se, right? And the relationship between individuals per se, right, has to be molded not on the caste system, but on notional constitutional morality. So, how do you cultivate that notional constitutional morality? How do you again go back to the language? Democracy in India is a top dressing, right? On a soil is essentially undemocratic. The caste system makes our fundamental relationships with each other fundamentally undemocratic. And how do you democratize those relationships, right? And again, this links up to the very important question of social transformation or change. How do you change society, right? Society can't be changed at the point of the sword. Society has to be changed. The metaphor of cultivate, right? How do you cultivate constitutional morality? And there, the answer may also be, right? The answer may also be partly an annihilation of caste. But part of the answer is the question of, again, in the Baker's terminology, when blood begins to mix with blood, right? The question of love marriages is one part of the way in which you cultivate constitutional morality. There are other ways you have to think about how you cultivate constitutional morality and how do you challenge, right, this way of thinking within the framework or nature of caste, right? And so that's I think that's one way to think about the notion of constitutional morality. One last point I want to make on this, on the question of constitutional morality, and then we can take any discussions, questions, any thoughts you have on it. But the last point I want to make is, again, right, I mean, reading a text, right? One way of reading it is read within the text itself. And that's the question of interpreting the opening speech, whatever Ambedkar says the constitutional morality, try and interpret or understand the term constitutional morality based on what has been said. And I think one of the comments I just thought, try to do that, right? Trying to say, hey, he's saying paramount reverence for the forms of the constitution. What does that mean? That's one way of doing it. Second way, which I was guiding you to, is saying, fine, we know that, right? Are there other reference points to constitutional morality in other texts by Ambedkar? May not be in the Constitutional Assembly, maybe elsewhere. And those two reference points which I found, right? And you look at that and say, hey, it roots the notion of constitutional morality in the soil of India. The question of majoritarianism, the question of the fact that majoritarianism needs to be challenged. So that framework, right, is the other one which you have, right, in terms of the challenge to the notion of of the caste system using the language of the terminology of constitutional morality and the idea of cultivating constitutional morality. The other way of reading is, I mean, just let's see if anybody can think of, see what I'm pushing you to do is a deeper reading of the text itself, right? If you
I
read
mean,
it,
it might be interesting to ask them a question on this whole issue of majority, which has become a controversy 3 days back. So do
can
they
I
all?
just finish this point?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just finish this. Give me just 2 minutes, and then we'll open it out for discussion on all these points. The last point I want to make, because I don't want to forget this, is that reading the text, right, between the opening speech and the closing speech, right? If you read it closely, right, again, what I'm urging you to do is close reading of both texts, right? And this might be just a opening part, and hopefully next time you'll be able to do a much closer reading. But the question I have is there anything in the closing speech which allows you to address the question that Ambedkar, in referencing the question of why of constitutional morality, is not just referencing the idea of the length of the constitution. He's doing something deeper. He's getting into the question of constitutional philosophy, of the concepts which underlie the Indian Constitution. There's a deeper thinking which he has, which is why he's going to the notion of constitutional morality. And I want to just read the last part to you, and then we'll open it out to Suresh's very important question on the majoritarian thinking, right? Which is, I want to open it to again. Wait, let me. Wait. Let me just first. Yeah, I think it's first I should open it myself, then it's easier. Okay. Okay. So just he references, in a sense, the drafting of course, when the closing speech, it's a very, again, closing speech is a very, very powerful speech, and it's really worth reading very, very closely, right? But just pick up on one point over here. Just read from the proceedings of the Constitutional Assembly.
Shall I read?
Please.
From the second para. The proceedings of the Constituent Assembly would have been very dull if all members had yielded to the rule of a party discipline. Party discipline, in all its rigidity, would have converted this assembly into a gathering of yes men. Fortunately, there are rebels. There were Mr. Kamath, Dr. P.S. Deshmukh, Mr. Sidhwa, Professor Saxena, and Pandit Thakur Das Bhargava. Along with them, I must mention Professor K.T. Shah and Pandit Hridaynath Kunzru. The points they raised were mostly ideological. That I was not prepared to accept their suggestions does not diminish the value of their suggestions, nor lessen the service they have rendered to the Assembly in enlivening its proceedings. I am grateful to them. But for them, I would not have the opportunity which I got for expounding the principles underlying the Constitution, which was more important than the mere mechanical work of passing the Constitution.
Yeah, why I shared this with you is actually just when this criticism came up, when the Nas judgment came out in 2009, which was the first reference to constitutional morality in the history of the Supreme Court, right? High Court, actually, the superior, both the High Court and Supreme Court. The first time it referenced is 2009 by Justice Shah, who was actually Chief Justice of your High Court, Madras High Court. And when it was referenced, I remember one of our friends, Vikram Raghavan, making the point. He says, "You guys are all misinterpreting what Ambedkar meant by constitutional morality." He says all the song and dance you're making and Justice Shah makes about majoritarianism, it's about the question of combating majoritarianism is absolutely not true. It's only his reference to constitutional morality is the length of the constitution. That's what actually impelled me to go a little bit into the historical background and see where the other references. That's one way of responding to it. He said that no, Vikram, you're wrong. Other references clearly indicate the question of the counter majoritarianism, which is a part of Ambedkar's thinking constitutional morality. Yeah. Repeat the last line, please. What was the last line, Vikash? Remind me, what was they say?
About
you were just talking about how everyone interpreted the constitutional morality wrongly, and what was the interpretation? I missed it. I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. Sorry. No, the point I was making is my friend, actually Suresh's friend as well, Vikram Raghavan, his response, right, to the Nas Foundation judgment in 2009, right?
maybe 1 minute about the NAS. About the NAS, people may not.
Justice Shah, in 2009, in the Nas Foundation, which decriminalized same-sex relationships in the Indian context, he makes a point, right? He says popular morality is a shifting morality, is a majoritarian morality. Constitutional morality rooted in the text of the Constitution, right? And the idea is we must interpret, right, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes same-sex relationships, not in the light of what the majority thinks, as I think Ravi mentioned in the beginning, but in the light of the morality of the Constitution, which is based fundamentally on respect for the dignity of the individual, regardless of what the majority thinks. You respect the dignity of right to individual choice, regardless of what the majority says. That was Justice Shah's interpretation. So Vikram's response, again, it's a technical lawyer's response, is saying, you got it wrong. You 100% got it wrong. You read Ambedkar's speech closely. He is only referencing the idea of the length of the Indian Constitution. Where do you get the idea of a combat of majoritarianism? And then that's when my mind, I said, let's look at this a little more closely. And so that's when I went, right, to looking at other references of Ambedkar in the Constitutional Assembly, which is what I shared with you, which the document will share later. So you get that sense of critique of majoritarianism. And the other point which I came to, which I thought was, again, interesting, was the last reference in the closing speech, right? Where he says, Ambedkar's own point, he says that when I'm responding to questions, I'm actually expounding on matters of constitutional philosophy, right? So we have to read constitutional morality in a broader sense. It's not a reference to the question of the length alone. It is a reference. It's Ambedkar expounding on a question of constitutional philosophy, right? Which it's a thread which runs through the framework of the Constitution. So, of course, this leads on, of course, to how the Supreme Court actually, I think, gets it right in interpreting constitutional morality as a challenge to a majoritarian morality or a thinking based on a majoritarian way of thinking, which leads us now to Suresh's question. So please, Suresh, please go ahead.
Yeah. Anyway, one interesting thing talking with you, Arvind, is you spoke of a whole lot of things. On constitutional morality, I think this issue came up also in the death penalty debate. Very simply put, a caste system legitimizes discrimination and says it is fate that some people are being born in the lower community, but it is also the cultural rule that they should be subservient to the upper caste. So that is what Ambedkar had called graded inequality. The whole thing is so graded and so finely tuned. So if you were to talk about democracy in a caste society, it will be unreal because there is no democracy in reality. So when he therefore talked about democracy as being a top dressing, what he essentially talked about was a new notion of democracy with a new idea of how the democracy should be based on certain democratic values of equality, equity, fraternity, dignity, etc., will have to be cultivated. Okay. Now, on this issue, what becomes very important is this notion of majority and minority. Recently, in the last 3 days, a big issue has come on the whole issue of majority. Would somebody know about it? And do you all know what you all think about the controversy? It's been a major controversy in the last 3 days on the whole issue of majority. Can we as a society decide to go ahead only on the basis of majority? If so, what will happen? That's a question that I think Arvind has posed before all of us. Can a society, a modern society, which calls itself civilized, go only on the basis of majority versus minority? If so, what will happen? I'm quite tempted to give leading answers or leading guidance.
Allahabad High Court judge
Yes.
talked at an event.
And what did he say?
I mean, I think he essentially vouched for majoritarianism. That's what we should follow, and talked about went on to talk about UCC and condemned certain practices of particular community as well.
Yeah, somebody else. And do you think that will be part of the constitutional morality that was discussed during constitution making?
I think that was specifically what it is against, right? I mean, constitutional morality has to stand above that.
Okay. What about others? Are others following this issue?
I think it's not only in the context of constitutional morality, I think it's unconstitutional. Being a judge and in a public forum speaking, favoring one majority religion, it's very unconstitutional.
But can we go a little more than just saying it's unconstitutional, Shakti? Can we go into constitutional logic to say why it is unconstitutional?
Because based on equality, every religion, including minority religion, is equal. So when he says one particular religion ruling the country, it is very much against the constitution.
Okay. What about others? Others following this issue? Thanks, Shakti. Yeah. Yeah, Vinay, go ahead.
Suresh, I'd like to point to what Ambedkar says about protection of minorities. He says that it is needed at this point, but over time, if we really live up to the values that we that are enshrined in this constitution, there won't be any minority at all, or the minorities will not need protection. But will the majority actually? But for that, it needs the majority to treat the minority as equal. He points to something to that effect. I'm not able to cite it. It's in the.
The majority loses its habit of discriminating against the minority will fade away. Contingent on the question, right? The majority should lose its habit of discriminating.
Yeah, exactly. So he clearly says that even, I mean, it shows that even 75 years later, it's the same story. I mean, there was that fear that the majority will discriminate, and they needed some they needed some safeguards there. But I'd also like to quote N.G. Ranga, I think, for the benefit of those who might not have read what I had already posted on the group. This is, he says, it is true that the majority can go mad, and therefore people have to be protected from their tyranny. And the majority can go mad in an unorganized and an organized fashion. If they go mad in an unorganized fashion without any leadership from the state or society or anybody, then it is a duty of the state to come into the arena and deal with those people as best as it might, even at the peril of its own existence. A state which is not prepared to restrain its own unorganized or disorganized majorities who believe in inflicting private punishment upon various people, whether they are organized or not, such a state does not deserve to exist. I mean, these are really strong words to say that, and he's foreseeing this possibility also. And he gives another scenario. He says, but on the other hand, if the majority is organized and it begins to function through the state itself, then who is to guarantee and uphold these fundamental rights? It may be said that the Supreme Court would be expected to do so. It is also quite possible that when an organized majority is functioning through the state and begins to misbehave in this fashion, the Supreme Court might be set at naught, as it happened in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. I think it's so prescient. They exactly predicted this scenario 75 years ago, and they tried to avoid this, but we have ended up here. And I think it should only inspire us that the makers of the Constitution have thought so deeply and have tried their best to avoid these scenarios. And now it is upon us to uh, take it back and redirect it in a different reorient the Constitution. I think it really needs us to put in the same kind of efforts and whatever feasible today to change the course of our Constitution.
Just to continue the debate and bring in another dimension. I mean, this class is not just about learning the Constitution, but like as Arvind has been trying to point out, it is to make us all think and ponder over various issues. So when we are looking at the issue of majoritarianism and minority, I think somebody had raised the issue, is it all about only percentages? So 99%, can any of you can you think of one community or one segment which is a majority or at least equal, but still oppressed? Can anyone think of one section which is like that? In terms of numbers,
women,
across the globe,
women,
any one section of society which may be equal in number. Did you say that? I didn't get you. Hello?
I said women.
Yes, you're exactly right. So majority and minority vis-a-vis constitutionalism, constitutional morality, I think you need to keep that it is not like, very linear or a straight-jacketed kind of concepts. We need to also now apply it to the context. Okay, one more example of a minority controlling the majority in a nation.
Casteism. Casteism.
Casteism, yes, but in a country, in a nation where we are looking at numbers, recently a nation which has become free. Apartheid, you had a white minority controlling the black majority. So when we are, looking in South Africa. So I'm saying when we are discussing about majority, minority, and constitutional morality, I think you need to look at this constitutional morality, keeping these various dimensions in mind, and just don't look at, numbers in terms of percentages. It's also a thought process. It is something, it's about control, it is about authority, it is about subjugation. So it's not about just numbers. And where does this logic take us? Like, for instance, today, in the context of today's context, which the Allahabad High Court judge spoke, or even Ambedkar, I don't know whether he was only looking at that one context, but we are looking at a Hindu and a Muslim, so majority versus minority kind of a dimension. Now, let us break it down into segments. What about linguistic minority? We have had movements in Maharashtra where, I don't know if how many of you have been following earlier news items about during railway recruitment, whole hordes of applicants who came from other states were driven away at the Mumbai railway station because they said, the Marathi people are being denied wages, denied employment. Now in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, it's a dispute over, water. So this whole majority, minority, that the majority will control and the minority will better fall in line. Now, whose majority, whose minority? Every person who is a majority vis-a-vis one aspect could tomorrow be a minority in a different dimension. So you may be a Hindu Tamil who is a majority here, but if we move to Karnataka, we may become a Tamil minority. So so you can just replicate it in various ways. So that is why we need some measure, a barometer by which we weigh these things, and which is your constitutional morality. What better a barometer than the Constitution and the preamble? Yeah, yes, Arvind, you can carry on. I just thought I'll throw in one more idea into the whole discussion.
Thank you.
One more view I wanted to share. Can I?
Please.
Please.
Yes, the individual has the liberty to practice their own religion, but practicing that seems to be like a punishment if it is going to be according to majority and minority. It is like they are being punished for exercising their constitutional right. That's it. Thank you.
True.
True. Which
No.
is why in India, they also recognize atheism. You have a right not to believe in a particular religion.
And again, let us not get stuck with Hindu and Muslim, because within Hindu, you have an entire, you fight when, what about Shaivism, Vaishnavism, then within that various sects. So it is not like there is one homogeneous majority or a homogeneous minority. So I think we need to keep these various dimensions in mind when we are looking at these arguments.
And the important point here is that these issues which are currently today in contemporary India, which is dividing India, where the issues that was discussed in 1947, 1949, and the constitution makers debated about it, fought about it, yet came to a certain conclusion, which is the conclusion that Arvind is, I think, been trying to highlight before all of us through Ambedkar's opening speech and the ending speech. Yeah.
There is one more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jairam.
Yeah. So there is one more thing that I wanted to point out.
You can put on
regarding
his
this,
camera, Jairam. If possible, yeah.
Yeah, so there is one more thing that I wanted to point out with respect to this is with respect to this whole constitutional morality. He also discussed. I mean, I felt when I read with respect to the political democracy and social democracy that he spoke about, where he said political democracy cannot last unless there is social democracy at the base of it, and recognize this trinity of equality, liberty, and fraternity as a way of life. And so that way of life is the constitutional morality. And this is the difference that we are practically seeing, the difference between what is going on in the country versus what needs to be done. The difference between the political democracy and social democracy that he spoke about.
True.
Yes, Arvind, over to you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Just as you can see, there's a lot to discuss, right? And on constitutional morality, I think we'll leave it to you to take it forward, but maybe again, two reference points which might be useful to understand the notion a little more closely. I think it's come up in the discussions. One, of course, is I mentioned NAS in 2009. Then, of course, the Navtej judgment in 2018, in which all the judges, right, Justice Chandrachud, Justice Indu Malhotra, as well as Justice Deepak Mishra and Justice Nariman, all of them reference the notion of constitutional morality. And there again, it fits very much within the framework of majority and minority. And of course, the understanding that just because you're a majority, it doesn't mean you can deprive the minority of its right to dignity. That's a very fundamental point, which the NAS judgment comes up with, right? And of course, the argument on the marriage judgment doesn't go. It doesn't. There's another issue there altogether. We can talk about that later, which is the question of how do you deal with the question of personal loss? That's the big, very, very challenging question, which it refers to. 2018 is the Navtej judgment. 2009 is the NAS judgment, both of which are decriminalization. 2009, why it's so important for the constitutional morality discussion, is the first time any court referenced the notion of constitutional morality using the Ambedkar speech is 2009, Justice Shah of the Delhi High Court, Chief Justice then, who was the Chief Justice of the Madras High Court, who I think both Suresh and Saila know very well at that moment in time. And 2018, of course, is again the decriminalization judgment, 5 judges, which again references the notion of constitutional morality. That's one reference. And Saila referenced the notion of gender, right? Gender and constitutional morality emerges very, very strongly in 2 judgments. One is the Sabrimala judgment, right? Again, it's a long judgment, but it's worth reading, where the court basically holds that when you prohibit women from the age of 10 to 50 from going to Sabrimala, then what you're violating is the norm called constitutional morality. Because the constitution cannot be based on uh, stereotypical ways of thinking about gender. Why are you prohibiting women from the age of 10 to 50 from going to Sabrimala? It's based on the stereotype that women of that between those ages will end up being attracting the men into giving up on the vow of celibacy, etc. And so women are prohibited. And that's based on a stereotype which is not acceptable in a constitutional sense. When you say 15 is non-discrimination, non-discrimination includes the fact that you can't then have stereotypical notions of both women and men. And the third judgment is the adultery judgment, right? Which again you should read. Again, adultery, right? The criminal law on adultery was basically the provision said this, right? If a man has sexual intercourse with the wife of another man, then the man is committing the offense of adultery. No women can commit an offense of adultery. Only men can commit the offense of adultery. On the face of it, you can say it's very progressive, very protective of gender, etc. But the way the court looks at it, what is it based on? Based on a stereotype, based on the legal doctrine called coverture, which is the idea that the woman is the property of the man. So, what is the law meant to do? The law is meant to protect the notion of property. What is the property? The property is the woman, right? And the fact that you're interfering in a man's right to completely enjoy his property is the problem, which the law is seeking to solve, or which is law is responding to. And again, they strike down that notion on the notion of constitutional morality. Right? So again, you see the link between the past and the present, where it becomes useful in all kinds of ways, in terms of the notions from the historical context, as it were. We'll I'll stop on that, on the question of constitutional morality, and and I want to get back uh, to the closing speech of Ambedkar. Right, again, I don't know if you'll. I hope all of you had a chance to read it. I think it's a brilliant exposition, right, of way he's responding to the concerns raised by various members of the constituent assembly. Right, one of the concerns raised is, why did it take so long to draft the constitution? Right? Why did it take so long? And how do you answer a question like that? Just think from the point of view of, how do you answer a question like that, right? And if you look at the nature of the logic he employs, right? It's very interesting. Right? It's a kind of firstly, it's a kind of deep dive into the making of the Indian Constitution. Right? He takes you to the entire process. He says initially we had this particular document, the document by B.N. Rao. Then you had various committees which were formed. Various committees submit the reports. Based on the reports of the committees, we do this. We come up with the draft constitution. Then each of the provisions of the constitution is debated. The thousands of amendments are moved. We debate each of those amendments, and of course, all of this takes time. That's one kind of a logic, right? You just go deep dive into it and explain. This is a concern people have. See, think of the way he's thinking. He's thinking like a lawyer, right? This is the concern people have. They're concerned about the question of why are you taking so long. Response to it by telling you what we have done in all this time. Thousands of amendments, various committee reports, all of which get incorporated and responded to by the by the Constituent Assembly. The other logic he uses again, which again Ambedkar is very, very good at, is the logic of the comparative, right? If you read the speech closely, you see he references, right? He references the American Constitution, references the Australian Constitution, says how long did they take for drafting the Constitution? What is the length of their Constitution? And so again, by comparison, he shows you that actually it's not such a long time. It's not such a long time for a document of this magnitude. It's not such a long time, right? And perhaps the contemporary reference, again, if you look at, if you remember, is again who masters or who uses this lawyer's technique very effectively, both internal and external, is there's an interview by Rahul Kanwar, I think, on with the Chief Justice Chandrachud at that moment in time, and the campaign at that time. Now maybe it's different. The campaign at that time was judges of the Supreme Court. They are very lazy people because they have long holidays. They're taking these long breaks. What are they doing with these long breaks, right? So again, you notice the way he responds to it, right? It's very, very interesting. He uses a very Ambedkar kind of method where he says that, what is the work that we do? The work that we do is we hearing a range of matters, of course. Then we're writing judgments. Look at the length of the judgments, 500 pages, 400 pages. We can argue whether it should be that long, but it takes time to write those judgments. Then he says comparative, right? What is the length of vacations of the US Supreme Court or the Australian Supreme Court, and Indian Supreme Court is vacations are far less in time. Then it looks at the range of cases, the number of cases. Indian Supreme Court, thousands of cases. If you look at either South Africa or the US, it's maybe less than 100 cases, right? So again, the method of reasoning Ambedkar uses to answer that first question of the length of the Constitution, I think it's worth reading. It's worth reading again for you to think of and say how you think of responding to a question. And here the important learning which I'm proposing for everybody to take away, everybody including all of us, including me, right, is take the comparative very seriously. We don't do that often enough, right? We know what's going on in our context. We don't necessarily reference what's happening in South Africa. We don't necessarily reference what's happening in other parts of the world, right? And that's a very, very important method of reasoning which is rooted, and reasoning which looks at comparison as a way of making your argument or making your case. So that's an important point which I think which Ambedkar makes, which I wanted to point out too. Let's now get to the closing speech. The opening speech, okay? I hope the closing speech is shared now. Can you see book 5 in front of you or no?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Yeah. This is what I already referenced, right? I mean, the question of, the work of the Constituent Assembly, 2 years, 11 months, 17 days, right? And so you look at the reasoning which he uses, right? And so again, I've mentioned this, I'm not going to go back, but you guys please read it. And the comparative method is there, as well as a deep dive into 2473 amendments, etc., right? Then the second point I want to make this again, I don't want to get into this, but just the notice again the ability, right, to reference. Again, this is a big debate which we keep having. Who's the actual draftsperson of the Indian Constitution, etc., right? And it might be useful to reference what Ambedkar says on the point as well, right? And the idea that the first draft is prepared by B.N. Rao, which is what Suresh indicated, and the idea of S.N. Mukherjee, who is the draftsperson of the Indian Constitution, and what the work that he does, right? And the Ambedkar's contribution again, right, is not like it's not to be. It's a very important contribution, and the contribution is the contribution of the, I think, right, is the contribution of constitutional philosophy, right? So the way of thinking about the Constitution, which is why the opening speech and the closing speech are so important, the most articulate exposition of the values underlying the Indian Constitution is Ambedkar, right? And that's the most important thing which you get from Ambedkar. And that's, as I mentioned, literally every provision which is debated, right? And you get a reference. Again, you see the opening speech, you see the closing speech. There's reference to Jefferson, there's reference to Edmund Burke, all the thinkers who were current at that moment in time get from Ambedkar. And so there's a sense in which the question of, of again, as a method, which is worth thinking about, the question of reading widely, right, is very important in terms of the way he's able to frame or formulate the arguments that he puts forward. Yeah? So okay, fine. This is the Jefferson quote. I just read the we may consider each generation as a distinct nation with the right by the will of the majority to bind themselves, none to bind the succeeding generation more than inhabitants of another country. Right. So the idea that fine, I mean, you are the constituent assembly, but what gives you the right to bind future generations, right? And so the response he has to that lies in the question of the flexibility of the amendment of the Indian Constitution, right? That's the answer. You're saying that, surely the Constitution as a document is there, but you haven't placed a procedure of amendment which allows for different generations to come to it with their own way of thinking. But of course, I mean, this is a question we might have a slightly different opinion on now, as in you might not want uh, the the fundamentals tampered with. But again, here I think the point would be to think intertextually, right? Think between the two texts and think of, what does Ambedkar mean when he says a facile procedure amendment? Does he mean the fundamentals of the constitution can be tampered with? And there you'd get the answer that no. I mean, you remember one of the opening speech, right, where he makes the point that, when somebody complains, right, at the fact that, somebody complains that, hey, the constitution is what's new in the constitution. So he makes the point that the fundamentals of a constitution are already being debated. They've evolved over a period of time. You go back to the objectives resolution, right? His response is that when Nehru moves the objective resolution, he's not making any great contribution. That's Ambedkar's viewpoint, because these are settled points. The idea of the French Revolution is a settled point, right? So when you say that constitution can change, right, it can't change in its fundamentals. I think that's quite. Again, that's the way you read the Jefferson quote with the other dimensions of the of both speeches, and see the way he's actually thinking about what change and transformation mean as far as the constitution is concerned, right? I want to know. Yeah. Yeah, that might be more akin to what we call the basic structure document. Fair enough. Yeah. Let's go to, I think, the point which is very, very useful for us now, which is the entire question of what I think one of you guys already referenced, which is the question of this is a very, very important section, right? Which is what are what are the three challenges you face to maintaining the democracy in form as well as in fact, right? And uh, the dangers he puts forward, of course, one is the possible rise of dictatorship in fact, while retaining democracy as a form. And that's, if there's a majority, if there's a huge majority, that danger always exists. Again, you can see the certain sense of precedence in terms of what a huge majority can do to the notion of democracy without tampering with the form, right? But the substance or the fact changes. And the second, of course, is concern is the idea that, how do you bring about a certain method of social change, as it were? This goes back again to Ambedkar's idea that democracy is really about how you transform or bring about transformation in a peaceful manner, right? And so the idea again here is the question that there's no justification of unconstitutional method and what he calls the grammar of anarchy, and of course the question of bhakti and bhakti worship. But let's get to the political democracy point, because I think that's the critical question, which I think again is very, very important. Somebody please read this.
May I?
Please.
Yeah. The third thing we must do is not to be content with mere political democracy. We must make our political democracy a social democracy as well. Political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. These principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. They form a union of trinity in the sense that to, to diverse one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Liberty cannot be diverse from equality. Equality cannot be diverse from liberty, nor can liberty or equality be divorced from fraternity. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty, and equality could not become a natural course of things. It would require a constable to enforce them. Should I
Let's
continue?
just look at that part. No, we'll just look at this part a little bit and get to leave the rest of it in a couple of minutes. The point I think your one of your colleagues made already, right? That political democracy cannot last unless there's a base of it a social democracy, right? Again, the idea that that there must be something more to what you mean by democracy than elections alone. And that's the important point over here, right? And for Ambedkar, obviously, elections alone are not enough. There's something more you need beyond the question of elections, and goes back again to the notion of constitutional morality, majoritarianism, etc. And that is what he calls the idea of a social democracy. And again, what does social democracy mean? To his thinking, liberty, equality, and fraternity is principles of life, right? And again, it's interesting. We say this oftentimes, right? That we say these three: liberty, equality, fraternity, but what do they mean, and how do they relate to each other, right? And here I just look at the what does he mean when liberty, they form a unity of fraternity in the sense that they divorce one from the others to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Liberty cannot be divorced from equality, equality cannot be divorced from liberty, nor can liberty and equality be divorced from fraternity. Right? And see, this is the crucial point, right? Without equality, liberty produces the supremacy of the few or the many, right? And that's you think of it, right? That's uh, the current model of a Western liberal democracy, where they have said, given the go by to the idea of equality, right? The focus is on liberty, right? Liberty, the fact that you must be free to do what you want to do, right? And such a society produces supremacy of the few of the many, and that's a huge, of course, a huge problem with that. And each of these lines we can debate and discuss a little more. What do you mean by without equality, liberty to produce the supremacy of the few of the many? And that you can think of as broadly a neoliberal. I would think of as a neoliberal model, right? Where the idea that the core point is we need less of a state. We need a weak state, or we need a state which plays a role of a night watchman. We need to have maximum freedom as far as individuals are concerned. That's the core point. The second point is, of course, equality without liberty to the individual initiative, that we can think of again as possibly the complaints which we hear, right? Which we heard during the what used to be called the license permit Raj, or what you can think of as the experiment of the Soviet Union, right? Where the idea that you make everybody you equal, you say equality And without fraternity, liberty, equality would not become natural course of things. So it requires a constable to enforce them. So in a sense, right, you get a. I think my net is again. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Or?
Yeah, we can hear you. We lost you for a little bit.
Okay,
We can hear you.
fine. Or should I just get? I think I'm disconnecting my phone again. Just take the link again. Sorry.
No, you're clear, Arvind.
Okay. 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 So his proposal, which is a quite a unique proposal, again, how it works out is something we have to think about, right? His proposal is that this tension between liberty and equality, you resolve the fraternity. Right? That's the proposal you have here. Right? That is so the core, absolutely the core item in the trinity of liberty, equality, and fraternity from a Ambedkar viewpoint is fraternity. Western liberal democracies are focused on liberty. That's not worked. The Soviet Union has focused on equality, and there's a problem with that frame as well. And so the proposal here is that if we think a fraternity that determines mediates liberty and equality, that is the way forward. Right? Okay, read the rest of it.
Arvind, could you repeat the part about equality without liberty in the Soviet Union? Janvi and Vikash have sort of asked to repeat that part. We just mentioned that.
Yeah, no. What this is again my reading, right? And people will have, I'm sure, people have many readings, so that's fine. But my reading is the Ambedkar reference to the societies which focus on liberty without equality is Western liberal democracies. And when the society is focused on equality and liberty is given the go by is the communist experiment, right? Which is the idea that the important thing is equality, and the question of liberty of the individual is not the concern, as it were. And Ambedkar's proposal is that these are two important terms. Both are important, right? You can't live without liberty. You can't live without equality. You need both, right? How do you get both? What is the bridge between liberty and equality? Is fraternity. Is what I'm reading as his proposal, right? So the way in which he foregrounds or centers uh, fraternity as a least understood term in the liberty, equality, fraternity debate. Again, you go to a range of books on Western political theory. The focus will be on liberty and equality, the tension between liberty and equality, right? And the question of fraternity is not often discussed. And again, you can think of Ambedkar as a key theoretician, a key thinker. The idea of fraternity, which in his view is the base, right? And so read the rest of it now. We must begin by acknowledging, please. Yeah, am I audible? Yeah,
Yes,
please
now.
do, please do.
May I continue? Yeah. We
Please.
must begin by acknowledging the fact that there is complete absence of two things in Indian society. One of these is equality. On the social plane, we have in India a society based on the principle of graded inequality, which means elevation for some and degradation for others. On the economic plane, we have a society in which there are some who have immense wealth as against many who live in abject poverty. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life contradictions? How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? We continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy, which this assembly has so laboriously built up.
Yeah, thank you. So again, this is, I think it's quite a self-explanatory point, but it's a very, very important point, right? Again, you think of somebody who is the closing speech, right, on the Indian Constitution, right? And the point which is coming up is the question that you can't think of democracy as a purely electoral democracy alone. That's the core point he's making in this speech, right? And he's justifying that. Again, the second part of it. You can hear me, right?
We can.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, super. Wonderful. He's justifying it in the second part, in this second, by the question of referencing both the question of the economic and the social dimension, right? Social dimension is, of course, the strong, again, the very strong reference point as far as caste is concerned, which is referenced again and again, is that it created inequality, right? And till the society moves away or deals with the problem of greater inequality, you can't have a social democracy, right? And cultivation of community, you have to go down that particular route, right? And that's a very challenging route. Again, to think of it, it's a very challenging route because it's not a the it's a question of transforming or cultivating constitutional morality, changing the way society thinks, is very, very challenging. The second point is equally challenging, but in a different way, which is the question of the economic plane. That is, you have wealth for some, wealth for few, and abject poverty for the others. And this is the contradictions we're entering to, right, on 26 January 1950. Again, very prescient for somebody to think on when you're giving a speech on the inauguration of the Indian Constitution. He's got the crux of it, right, which is that you have equality in political life, but inequality in social and economic life, right? And unless you solve the problem of economic inequality, the structure which we've built up may blow up, right? The structure of political democracy which we've built up may blow up. So we have to resolve this contradiction. Is I think the very important point being made. Again, the why it's so prescient and so important. If you make the connection to today, you I've referenced this, and Suresh has referenced this in the previous class as well. You go to you go to the recent book by Thomas Piketty is a very important one, right? Where he makes the point that India is among perhaps the most unequal societies in the world. So that's a think back to this Ambedkar speech, right? So what does he say? This the laborious structure of political democracy we built up will be blown up if you don't address the social and economic inequality at the heart of the Indian social, political, and economic order, right? And so that's a very, very present, very important point, and it's also a call to us to think more deeply, right? What are the problems that we have? So if you say the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of fascism, the rise of majoritarianism, what do you link all of that to, right? And the link to all of that in an Ambedkar analysis is to social and economic inequality. That's a problem you have to resolve. And of course, you've not resolved it. If anything, the problem is worse today than it was in 1950. And that is the Piketty point, right? Where he says India is the most unequal societies in the world. And it's more unequal today than it was in the colonial era, right? And that's a strong indictment of what the Indian state has done, in particular, in the last, since the liberalization era began. right? So there's a call to think more deeply of the question of both social and political democracy, and to resolve the problems of inequality, which is both social and economic. If you don't want the political structure to blow up, right? So again, this I think raises many questions for us, right? And among the big questions is, if you want to defend this structure called this is challenging all of us actually. We want to defend this this the Indian Constitution, right? Is the defense of the Indian Constitution enough? Only in terms of defense of what the frame of the Constitution itself, or do you have to fundamentally talk about the question of economic inequality, right? And if it address the question of economic and social inequality, is there something which is deeper, which you have to address to actually defend the Indian Constitution? So, can the defense of the Indian Constitution be based within the terms of the Indian Constitution itself? Or is there a deeper kind of analysis or thinking required, which is about addressing fundamentally the questions of economic and social inequality? So, there's a way in which do you bring a defense of the Constitution together with the language of addressing social and economic inequality? So that's I think the challenging question which is being raised
Arvind, I can come in here.
in the closing speech. I think that yeah, please come in now. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's the point that Arvind has stated now, which is raised from what Ambedkar talks about, is a very important principle that Ambedkar embodied in the entire constitution. I think all of you have the speech, the last speech of Ambedkar with that photo on the thing. In the second page, you will see there's a paragraph saying, Ambedkar points out that by and large, almost all the members agreed that the the drafting committee had done a good job. He makes a remark in the second page to one Mr. Naziruddin Ahmed, who has been very caustic about the drafting committee. If I can just read it, it says, Mr. Naziruddin Ahmed has coined a new name for the drafting committee, evidently to show his contempt for it. He calls it a drifting committee. Mr. Naziruddin must no doubt be pleased with his hit, but he evidently doesn't know that there's a difference between drift with mastery and drift without mastery and drift with mastery. I think this is a wonderful words, both in terms of English coinage, the way he put it in a very sophisticated way. Ambedkar beautifully put it, between drafting and drifting. And that's what he actually points out when he comes down to the last part of the speech, where he talks about political democracy and social democracy, and highlights a very important point, that a constitutional principle is not a legal principle by itself. Just as a legal principle, it has no meaning. If you come down to the last, but second page, the third point, the point that Arvind had pointed out, the third point is that political democracy, and that's the seventh page, political democracy and social democracy. Let us go down. Now, the important point that is coming here is that the Constitution is not just a dead letter word to be used by this is it. It's Constitution is not just something to be a text used by lawyers or by judges or in courts. The Constitution gets life, and ordinary people apply constitutional principles in their day-to-day life. And that is what Ambedkar beautifully points out. Now look at his intellectual capability. On one hand, he says our constitution, barring this one person, everybody has agreed that it's a very good, it's a very well written constitution. So we need to be justifiably proud. At the same time, he says, while the form of the constitution is very commendable, let us not forget this constitution, just as words in a book, has no meaning unless you change the substratum of our society, which is divided and fractured on so many lines. Unless those fractures are addressed along with political democracy, this will not be a true constitutional democracy. And that's where the term of constitutional morality also becomes very important. So the constitutional morality are actually new concepts which are brought into independent India. If you remember the slide I showed you last time, look at the immense problems that India was facing in 1949. between 1947 to 1949. Massive illiteracy, massive health problems, maternal mortality, infant mortality hitting the roof, worst across all the countries in the world. Women not allowed to vote, women considered to be properties of the men, Dalits and other lower castes not considered to be human beings at all. Landlords had the freedom to do whatever they wanted to do with the landless laborers. In that context, Ambedkar then writes about this, reminding through his speech, not just to the Constituent Assembly members, but to the people of India, that look, we are giving this, we have all together created this, but this is it's something that can disappear very fast unless the soil of social democracy changes. So the importance of this class is also to highlight that these concepts are not concepts meant for books. These concepts has to be brought about in our streets. Tomorrow, when we go and talk to a collector, tomorrow, when you go and talk to your school principal or your college principal, or you talk to your boss, or you talk to anybody in authority, anybody in whatever form of authority, social authority, political authority, livelihood authority, whatever type of authority, we need to be able to talk this language where we are not begging for rights. We're not saying, please give us these rights. We're saying, because we are human beings born in this land that is called India, this comes to us by the fact of our birth and not because of generosity of anybody. That exactly would be what social democracy he talks about. Okay, which is why we need to apply. So like last time I was giving an example of how the fishing community people went to when they met the IAS officer and told him, look, you are getting paid from our taxes. So you are a servant. No, don't think that you can decide what we will do. You better do the work that you are paid for. Until this becomes a language of our people, and this language pushes to change, you will ultimately have only the old form of dominance, perhaps with new names, with new faces, and in new forms. But unless that entire form of discrimination, which is embedded in the social, cultural, and other structures, change can never be democratic. And that's a lesson that Ambedkar leaves us with. That this is a very fragile baby, one can use a metaphor, that the Constituent Assembly is gifting citizens. And that's why the preamble says, we the citizens of India. So every time a child is born, every time a child reads the preamble, the child is committing themselves to what the Constitution values are and the history of the Constitution. I just thought I'll highlight this, because this is something I keep arguing every day in court. Even recently, I had the need to remind the court and the other lawyers about this whole thing. And that's how it has become part of our day-to-day life. Over to you, Arvind.
So what you just said, is that what can be called as constitutional morality?
That be constitutional morality in the speech, but constitutional morality would be in the practice. It's in the reality of how we as Indians relate with each other. Only when we bring that, will that become the true constitutional morality in a constitutional democracy. How do we bring it today, 2024? Last week, lower caste woman, police constable, who married a Dalit boy, who helped her to study and helped her both financially, morally, as also in terms of other ways, intellectually. She was killed by her brother because she dared to marry a Dalit boy. And she's a police constable. This happened about 4 days or 5 days back. It's a matter of honor killing. How different have we really moved in these 75 years? Are questions to ask. And therefore, the question to the Kudam, to all of us is, how do we understand social democracy, the reality of social democracy today? How did it come to where we are today? And what is each one of us going to do about it? We can go back to Arvind, handing over to you.
Arvind, are you there? I think your screen's frozen.
Take out the spotlight. You can open it up for discussion. Arvind? Is Arvind there? He's there.
Oh, I'm there. Uh, Now we can open it up for discussion, and we can think of what any responses people have, because it's a very, obviously, very important part of the closing speech. And the only point I shared, please look at it later, is the Piketty paper, right? And see how you can connect that and his argument on inequality in India with Ambedkar's closing speech. That's one. And the last point I'd make, which again for your consideration, you see, a lot of us have memorandums to draft and all responses to various issues, etc., etc. And part of the logic of getting you to read this a little more closely is pick up on these ideas, right, and see how you can utilize it in terms of representations you may make, you may have to make, etc. Maybe the last point, which again uh, maybe we should look at, is the last part of the speech. Okay, the inequality you'll look at later is yeah uh, is the reference to the principle of fraternity, and we're not going to read the whole thing again, but just you can see it, right? You can see the text in front of you.
Yeah,
You
we
see the
can
text?
see. Yeah.
The highlighted part, right? Which is the sooner we realize that we're not as yet a nation in the social and psychological sense of the word, the better for us. For then only can we realize the necessity of becoming a nation and seriously think of ways and means of realizing this goal. Right? And the realization of this goal is going to be difficult, far more difficult in the United States. US had no caste problem, in India there caste. So again, the question of caste he really foregrounds. The castes are anti-national in the first place because they bring about separation in social life. The anti-national also because they generate jealousy and antipathy between caste and caste. But we must overcome all these difficulties if we wish to become a nation in reality. Fraternity can be a fact only when there's a nation. Without fraternity, equality and liberty will be no deeper than coats of paint. Right? Again, you get the centrality of going back again and again to the notion of fraternity, which we already referenced. I don't think I need to go further into it. We can open it out now for any other thoughts, comments people may have.
There's one question by Janvi. Why did Ambedkar want to abandon civil disobedience, non-cooperation, satyagraha? Is there history to this? I was surprised to read this.
See, the again, that's an interesting question. But at least my reading, again, people might have different readings of it. Is Ambedkar is at heart, right? Is a constitutionalist, right? In terms of the way he approaches or deals with issues. Even if you look at the Mad Satyagraha, right, which is something which Ambedkar led, uh, the story goes like this. Initially, they march to the Chowdhury tank and drink the water in the tank, right? And then there's a range of opposition. Then they decide to come back a couple of months later and to again drink that particular water. In the meantime, there's a case filed uh, which prohibits, right? And they get an injunction from the civil court. The upper castes get injunction from the civil court prohibiting the Dalits from drinking the water from the tank. And there's a huge debate whether they should disobey the state or not disobey the state. Now, because at the point in time takes the viewpoint that we will not disobey the state because we don't want to be both the state and society against us. Right? So there's a way in which constitutionalism is very integral, or working within the terms of the law is very integral to Ambedkar's way of thinking. That's one point to keep in mind when you interpret this. But the second point is that you're talking about a time when democracy is the constitution has just been drafted, right? You're not living under an alien government. You're living under your own government. It's 1950, right? 1960, the answer may be different. 1970, the answer could be different. But 1950, you just drafted the constitution, and you must, of course, work within the framework or the limits the constitution imposes. Otherwise, why have a constitution in place at all? Why spend all the time and energy drafting the constitution? Right? That's the way of thinking in the 1950s. That'll be my answer, but there could be other answers to the question.
There's another question. What was the specific opposition that Mr. Nasiruddin had against the drafting committee?
You read it closely, read the text of the constitution closely, you don't get a sense of. I mean, I'm inclined to go with Ambedkar's kind of very sarcastic, right? Very sarcastic comment that he's a very disgruntled member who wanted to be, right, on the drafting committee. As he puts it, Ambedkar puts it, it's not our fault, it's not my fault that the assembly didn't deem him worthy of the privilege of being on the drafting committee, right? So there's a certain way in which there's no in Ambedkar's reading, which seems to be the case, because you don't get a sense of Nasruddin as being a rebel in the form of, say, K.T. Shah, right, or Kamath. K.T. Shah and Kamath, for example, whenever they, as Ambedkar puts it, they raise ideological points. Shah's point throughout is to stress socialism and saying that socialism is being ignored. And Kamath is broadly a civil liberties kind of a perspective, is what you get from Kamath, right? And he sees that as opposition, but very precious opposition, right? Because it's something which allows for a debate on deeper issues which matter. Nasruddin, you know, inclined to completely agree with Ambedkar that, he's a disgruntled member at best. But again, maybe a closer reading will throw another interpretation of this. Huh? So I'm open to that possibility.
So we have 10 minutes. We can open it for questions. If bandwidth allows, if you can come on camera and just ask your questions, we can have a dialogue in the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, I have a question about minorities and the majority. So in Ambedkar's opening speech, he says that minorities and majority have followed the wrong path, and then he says that the solution must be to enable majorities and minorities to merge someday into one. So, like, what vision of society does he have with respect to majority and minorities? Like, does he want to, it's like, erase the distinction, I guess, between different groups and communities, or is he seeking, I guess, like a harmony amongst different groups?
In my reading, again, we can all have different readings of that speech, right? My reading would be that the reason minorities exist as a political grouping is because of the discrimination practiced by the majority against the minority. I mean, you can have a different style of dress, you can have a different way of living, you can have a different faith, but if you're not discriminated against for that, it's not a political distinction which makes you into a majority or minority. The majority or minority in a political sense only emerges when you're subject to discrimination. So this point is this, right? If you lose the habit, if the majority loses the habit of discriminating against a minority, then the difference is not relevant anymore. There are all kinds of differences we have, right? Some people are left-handed, some people are right-handed. We don't necessarily discriminate on the basis of the hand. We may not necessarily discriminate on the basis of the color of one's head. We may not necessarily discriminate on the fact of whether you're bald or not bald, etc. That may not be the case, right? But when a distinction or a difference becomes politically relevant, such that it becomes a question of discrimination, that's when the majority minority question becomes relevant. So his point is that if you're discriminating as a grouping and we lose the habit of discriminating, then that difference is not politically salient anymore. It doesn't matter anymore. You can be whoever you are. How does it matter?
Go ahead, Mayura.
Arvind, so when I was reading through what was Ambedkar saying, talking about, discussing during the presentations and also closing speech, I was thinking this is very much relevant now, but I was also thinking maybe it's a prediction, but I don't think it's just mere prediction, but what was happening back then and what is happening very much now. So I was thinking, were there any efforts made to cultivate constitutional morality right after India became independent democratic country? But because if it was cultivated back then, I don't think we would be discussing much now.
It's a good question. And my own feeling is the discussion on constitutional morality only enters the political realm post 2009, right? With the entire question of the Nas judgment. So that's the contribution of the Nas judgment to thinking this notion. But was work done on constitutional morality before 2009? I'd say yes, but maybe not using that specific terminology or language, right? People didn't make that connecting link between the constitution, the morality, and what the work being done, right? For example, if you take the Special Marriage Act with all its flaws and the many, many flaws, right, which don't allow it to be operationalized as it should, but the concept is that you can marry across lines of religion and caste, right? And that's you can read that as an actualization of a vision of constitutional morality, right? You can read a range of provisions, of course, in the Constitution as an actualization of the vision of constitutional morality. But your point is a specific one, right? It's the question of, it's when you say cultivate constitutional morality, you mean you have to challenge the norms of society, right? How do you challenge those norms of society? Article 17 is a kind of a criminalization approach. But other approaches, the other approach, of course, the intercaste, interreligious marriage is one kind of approach. Are there other ways in which to promote this question of 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 linking across lines of caste, religion, and gender, sexuality, etc. Right? It's a question, and it's a question which we should engage much more deeply with. I don't think civil society is necessarily engaged with it in these terms to 2009. Right? 2009 is the starting point of thinking of the language of constitutional morality.
If I can add here, Vinod, I think what you raised is a very important point. See, what Ambedkar did was to place in the intellectual mapping of our country these concepts of, particularly the distinction between political democracy and constitution and social democracy, and arising from that the issue of constitutional morality. Okay. Now, unfortunately, we are living in context in which there are multiple groups which are fighting each other in terms of power, authority, control, etc. And the same thing happened even at the time when Ambedkar was there. Ambedkar's greatest contribution is to come out with the moral mapping of what India should be like, and leaving it as part of the constitutional mapping for us so that we can talk about it today. The political reality was very different. For example, even after Ambedkar becomes the law minister in India, he resigns in 1956, just a couple of months before he eventually passes away, on the whole issue of the Hindu Code Bill, and the fact that many things that he had pushed forward were not accepted by the then ministry. He resigned, saying that I have no place in this place, which is largely made up of upper caste people and upper caste sensibilities. Okay. Now, all through, you see ultimately the fight between the upper caste, middle caste grouping and the Dalits and the lower caste groupings all across, even till today, it is happening all across India. Just to give you one more example, the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act. And that's an area I've done my PhD in. For example, it was postponed 3 times because there was no quorum, despite the fact that in Parliament, despite the fact that the Congress was pushing it. It happened in the background of the Karamchedu and the Sunduru massacres, some other massacres in Bharatpur in Rajasthan and other places. Again, because of the lack of interest in the upper caste people to support and come out with a law like the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act. So all along you have history of how across all the political parties, they pay lip sympathy to issue of caste equality, when in reality they were also themselves very casteist in terms of their politics. Now, that unfortunately is the larger battle that Ambedkar pointed out to, but was not taken up after him. So you're very right. If the constitutional morality part they had actually sought to bring about in textbooks, in our universities and schools, in the government programs, perhaps we might have been able to address the issues that are still plaguing us today. Issues of caste discrimination, gender discrimination, sexuality discrimination, and so many other types of discriminations that Ambedkar points out in a very smaller way in 1949. But that's a task we will have to take up. He has left us the imprint for us to take over.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Suresh is, I think it's also a very big challenge for us in our country. It's like while the theoretical framework is there, and I mean Ambedkar was fighting. It's not like while they have all, I mean, the constitution has been passed and accepted, but throughout he talks about the dissensions and the differences even within the same constituent assembly. He was talking about the far left to the far right, who are all part of this milieu. So, and I think somewhere the Congress regime at that time were trying to find this some kind of a common minimum, point where some things they could push, some things they could not push. For instance, even since we are talking of the Hindu Marriage Act and the Hindu Succession Act. Now, the fact, while yes, the marriage laws, as far as the Hindus are concerned, is a far more liberal, where they brought in grounds for divorce and etc. But if you're looking at the Hindu Succession Act, the right to women to property, especially in the ancestral property, came much later. It's come like, in the 80s and the 90s. So until then, Indian women, Hindu women were denied equal right to property of their ancestral property. So that discrimination continued. And I think one of the reasons why it is so difficult to bring in this constitutional morality and social and while the political equation was much more easier because the systems are all external. But when you're talking of social factors, it actually comes into each one's house, because now caste is in all our houses. Gender, again, women equal, I mean, gender is in each, it's in our bedrooms, it's in our each one's kitchens, it's in our drawing room. So it is that much more difficult for us to deal with it and to bring in that is why this bring home the constitution. I think in the very beginning, that's why we said it is bringing home the constitution is not just digitally that all of us can sit and log in. It's much more than that. How can we bring in this so-called principles of constitutional morality? And if we want to make it a reality in our country, it is not something which has to be done out there in the parliament or by the bureaucrats or by the judges or by the lawyers. It is for each one of us to bring it into our homes. And how do we build this fraternity, this equality, this liberty that we are talking about? Is not somewhere else. So that is why it makes it much more difficult, much more challenging, because it's so entrenched in our lives that we have normalized discrimination. Because what is casteism essentially? We don't even think it is wrong. When we see a person like our own mates in the house who may come to help, I think it doesn't even seem odd if they are asked to take the back door or not walk through the kitchen. So much of discrimination we have normalized. So even to make us sensitive to this discrimination, to make that discrimination visible, I think is the first step, that we first recognize it as, when we are seeing slums being evicted. So we want the cheap labor of the slum dwellers to work in our factories and in our houses, but we don't want the slums in our neighborhoods. So this kind of contradiction. So as a society, we are very comfortable living with such contradictions in every aspect of our lives, that we have normalized discrimination. And until we first become conscious, and then not just conscious at an intellectual level, but an emotional level, we feel uncomfortable with this kind of a social setup. And then each one of us takes it upon ourselves to change the society. I don't think, the constitutional morality that Ambedkar is talking about will get rooted in the soil. That is what he said. Unless it takes root in the soil, this constitution is of no meaning. So I think it is the duty of each one of us to start that journey of transformation, beginning with ourselves. So I think that is what this whole bringing home the constitution is all about.
Yeah.
I think it's 10.
Yeah, it's 10. Just to end up, it's very ironic that this Justice Yadav, a sitting judge of the Allahabad High Court, talks about in his speech about how in Hindus we marry, there's only one wife you can marry, whereas there are other communities where they can marry 4 times. A very clear whom he is referring to. Okay, but he does not talk about the fact that amongst the Hindu across India, maternal mortality, maternal nutrition is amongst the worst compared to Muslims and compared to the other communities. That they will not talk about.
No, and even apart from that, I think there are statistics to show the number of Hindu men having more than one wife, even though it is not supposed to be legal, is much more than number of Muslims having multiple wives. So maybe it is legally sanctioned, but this is socially sanctioned. Men having more than one wife is socially sanctioned in our country, though it may be illegal. So we have had a chief minister of Tamil Nadu who openly acknowledged the presence of his two wives and who sat alongside with him in all social functions, and nobody criticized it or objected to it, because as a society we think it is okay for a man to have many wives. I mean, we have not yet accepted a situation where if a woman comes and with two husbands, I think that is not something which many will accept. So this is the kind of, hypocrisy that we are willing to live with and make these, statements. Yeah,
Parimala has a question/comment. Ambedkar justifies the centralization of power in the draft constitution by comparing the federal government form. Maybe it would have suitable for during the independence time. We had many issues that time, but the same lack or less rigidity in the federal government, which Ambedkar justified, is giving way for authoritative government now. Was it expected
We read it.
Ambedkar somewhere? Sorry?
No, I said we read it, Shantanu, and my suggestion is that we'll take this up in the federalism discussion when
Correct.
we come to it.
Because that's a big topic in itself, federalism, so I think the
Topic, yeah.
Yeah.
But Parimala, that is a very good question. But we'll come back to that. This less rigid, more rigid. I think we need to talk a lot more and explore that more.
So I think again you have to go back to Ambedkar for reference, because he says ultimately no matter what you write, a lot depends on the people who are actually running the government. You can write the best of the constitution, but if it is managed by the set of people, they can turn it on their heads. So yeah, these are all larger debates that we can go into. So should we wind up?
Thank you, Kamala.
Yeah. Normally what we do is that a few people, this is part of the Kodam thing, 3 or 4 people talk about what they felt about very briefly. Just finish it off so we can finish. Would any wind up, and we'll meet up next Wednesday.